Good afternoon, Friends of Liberty. My name is Dan Fishman. I am the Executive Director of the People for Liberty. And we're going to talk about one of the things that people tell you never to talk about. You know, we're told to never talk about politics. Clearly, that's working out for us. Not talking about religion, probably a good idea. But also, we've been taught to not talk about money. And that is not only hurting people, but it's especially hurting us here in the Liberty Movement. I was just at Freedom Fest last week, and it was an expensive prospect to go there. Round trip for me from Washington, D.C. Please don't judge me by where I live, but from Washington, D.C. to Rapid City, South Dakota was $1,000. Hotel for a week was $1,000. Fortunately, I didn't have to rent a car. I had brought my brother's car with me, but it was there was no Uber, so people were spending a lot of money on taxis. All those things cost money, and money is a defining factor in what we're able to do for liberty. And the amount of money that you have right now is greatly related to obviously your job, but also there's a lot of choices you can make, a lot of wise choices and a lot of foolish choices that you can make that will influence how much money you have now and later in your life. So we're going to bring on Evan Shelton. Hey, Evan, how's it going?
Hey, Dan. Going well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So first, let's talk a little bit about you and the Liberty Movement. Now, I know you are in Tennessee, which is the volunteer state, and has an outstanding libertarian party, including one of my favorite elected libertarians in Tricia Butler. How about you? Are you involved in the Liberty Movement in Tennessee?
I am. Yes. I started getting involved with the Libertarian Party specifically in 2016. What an interesting time that was. And I started plugging into the local affiliates in the Nashville area, but I relocated to Knoxville a couple months ago, and I've started plugging into the volunteer region, which is Knoxville and the surrounding counties. And I've met a lot of great people already.
Awesome. I think that there really is something true to the fact that once you get away from the coast, people are more intrinsically inclined towards liberty. I mean, do you feel that? Like you see stuff happening in California and New York and Massachusetts and think that would never happen in Tennessee.
Yeah, certainly. I've never, made the connection of it having anything to do with being on the coast, but that's an interesting observation. But certainly, it's a different world here.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the salt water. I just think that there's,
there's something in the water, maybe.
Older and bigger government. Well, so one of the things we wanted to talk about is, sort of basic financial literacy. And I thought a good way for us to start that conversation would be to take a financial literacy quiz. And so I've got one right here brought to us by the the Investors Education Foundation. So I'm going to start. The first question says, suppose you have $100 in a savings account earning 2% interest a year. After 5 years, how much would you have? So I'm going to complain up front that we can't know the answer to this because we don't know the rate at which the interest is compounded, how often it is done. It could be quarterly, it could be monthly, something like that. And so let's talk about that first, about what rate of return is when we talk about, a savings account. If I say 2% a year, what does that sort of mean?
Yeah, great question, Dan. So 2% per year is the rate of return. But as you mentioned, the frequency of how often it's compounded is relevant too, because how often it compounds is determined by how frequently the interest is actually paid into the account. And then when that money is paid into the account on top of what you already have, that interest also starts to grow at that same interest rate. So you kind of get an exponential growth rate there. So that's very important.
I was going to say, that's one of those things that people probably know, the basic math trick that you learned in 4th grade. If you were given the option of getting a penny a day and then doubling the amount that you had every day, how long would it be before it's $1 million? And it's way less than a month. That sort of thing, the compounding of the interest. I can tell you in 8th grade, there was a kid in my school who, if you didn't have lunch money, absolutely, he would lend you money. But it compounded daily on the amount of time it took you to pay you back. So, it was pretty impressive. He gave us all a great financial literacy lesson, which all things considered came relatively cheaply. So I'm gonna come back to the quiz, and I'm going to say that $100 in a savings account turning 2% interest a year. How much would it be? And our options are more than 2%, exactly $102, less than $102, don't know. So let's talk about this too as a vehicle in terms of safety. A savings account is a pretty safe place to have your money, especially if you only have $100 in there, right?
Sure.
Yeah, because for people who don't know, the FDIC guarantees all your money in a bank account under $100,000. And I think that there's a special class of account where they guarantee more than that, but I can't remember exactly what it is. But certainly if you have under $100,000, you're not going to lose any money. So I'm going to say that it's more than 102, and we're going to go on to the next question. So the next question is, imagine that the interest rate on your savings account is 1% a year and inflation is 2% a year. After 1 year, will the money in the account buy more than it does today, exactly the same as it does today, or less than today? So in this case, let's just assume that it compounds. You get your interest payment once, because I think that's what they're going for. Now, again, this is kind of a vague question too, because inflation affects a lot of different things, and we'll get into the consumer price index a little later on. But when they talk about inflation, it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship with your money. But I think what they're going at is that there are times that having money sitting in a bank account isn't a great place to have your money compared to other investment options. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, about how inflation, because we're probably on the cusp. We had a guest on, an economist 2 weeks ago, who predicted 6% inflation by November. And if you believe that that's true, you probably don't want to have a lot of money in a bank account, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's a great point, Dan, because even if it's not perfectly lined up with the power of your money right now, inflation over time does reduce the amount of spending power you have in your money. So just for an apples to apples comparison, if you make 3% rate of return per year on your money and the inflation rate is 3%, then you effectively have the same amount of spending power a year later as you did when the process started. So you need to beat the rate of inflation overall in your investments in order to actually increase your spending power.
So, there's some pretty good examples of places where that's gone crazy. And, the one that people are really most aware of, I think, is, in Wehrmacht, Germany, in between World War I and World War II, they had hyperinflation, where the prices were changing by as much as 100% a day because the currency was so useless. And so that leads us to another fascinating conversation about the difference between currency and items of value, because a lot of people think, an item of value is the same as currency. Currency is valuable. But in fact, if you look at what the difference is between inflation in terms of the value of, let's just say, an acre of land, and, let's say it's $1,000 right now, when we have inflation, the currency changes, but the land still fundamentally has the same value, right?
Right. Yes. Now, there are conditions that can cause the value of the land to change as well. But just in relation to inflation, the value of the money is dropping because the numbers are getting bigger, but it buys the same amount of stuff, land being the example in this case, and all other things being equal, the land still has the same value to the person buying it. So that's what makes a big difference over time.
And then one of the things that I like to tie into that is that, in fact, if you have a lot of currency, the government has a capacity to steal some of your wealth. And we saw that during quantitative easing, when the government was putting $48 billion a month into the stock market. So what happened? The value of stock went up after 2008. If you invested in 2008 and held on to your investments, you are a happy camper right now, because the market plunged, and then the government threw a lot of currency into a thing. Fortunately, we had an advisor who said, now is the time, buy a bunch of blue chips, because their value isn't going to change. And sure enough, so, one of the companies that we bought was Ford. Even though, there was a big automotive crisis, Ford went up over 100% in the next year. Now, they didn't build any new factories. They didn't make any more cars or anything like that. It was clear that the currency had been devalued and the stock had gone up. And in fact, it was a transfer of wealth from the savings class to the investing class. It was actually, under Obama's administration, direct theft of money from people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're speaking to a couple things there too, Dan, not only the quantitative easing and the transfer of wealth, but the fact that you can oftentimes invest and get more value for your money. And a more recent example was during March of last year, when COVID started shutting down the travel industry, and people who jumped into a lot of the travel investments have started to see a lot of that bounce back already. So it's kind of like buying it when it's on sale. And unfortunately, that's when a lot of people are afraid to start investing, but it's some of the best opportunities available.
Right. And you can get in relatively cheaply at those prices.
Right.
One of the ones that I confess, I like to invest into the teeth of a disaster. One of my favorites was after BP let loose all that oil into the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, which is a terrible tragedy. But once I saw the government come in and say, okay, their limit on damages is $40 billion, I'm like, that's it. That is a measurable thing that I can go for. I look just the flat numbers. I should invest in BP at this point in time. I have not regretted it. Bank of America is another one that people thought, oh, it's a big banking crisis, stuff like that. I was pretty sure Bank of America wasn't going to fold. And so when it was at $3, that seemed like a good investment price. So let's go back to the quiz. Where am I? Oh, what did I do? Let's see, remove, add. There it is. So we're going to say that we're going to guess that they mean exactly the same. Oh, no, wait. Inflation is 2% and my interest rate is 1%. It's going to be less. Next question. If interest rates rise, what will typically happen to bond prices? Rise, fall, stay the same. Now, that's an interesting thing because a lot of people don't understand what the interest rate is. And I'll tell you sort of my neophyte explanation, and you can tell me what you think about it. I've always felt that interest rate is essentially the price of money. It's what you pay to borrow money. It's what somebody would pay you to borrow money from you. And that's all I think of the interest rate is. And so it affects what people are able to do, what they're able to buy, because it affects their ability to borrow money. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And it really comes down to the prime rate, which is set by the Federal Reserve. And, they'll move that around to do things like quantitative easing. But more to the point of bonds, they are absolutely affected by the interest rate. So it's more than just the price that you pay for money. It also affects different investments that you can have in your portfolio. So it's important to be aware of that as also.
Yeah, and can you explain what the difference is between a bond and a stock, and let's just say a mutual fund as well, the three of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So a stock is probably what most people are most familiar with out of those three. A stock is a small piece of ownership in a company. So if you purchase a stock, you now own a share or a tiny piece of ownership in that company. And the reason you would want to do that is that has a value attached to it. And if the value of the company overall increases, then the value of your piece of the company that you own also increases. Now, some companies will also pay part of their profits out to shareholders in the form of dividends as well. A bond, on the other hand, is not a piece of ownership in the company. It's actually probably most essentially you giving a loan to the company. They sell you a bond, you're giving them money in exchange. They're using your money to fund their operations. And in exchange, they're agreeing to pay you a coupon, which is basically an interest rate on the money that you've loaned to them. So you don't own a piece of the company, but you've loaned them money and they're going to pay you back that money with interest. Now, a mutual fund, imagine a bucket. So we've talked about what stocks are. They're a small piece of ownership in a company. Say you take 90 to 200 different companies, take a stock of each of those and throw it in a bucket. That bucket is a mutual fund. It's a collection of generally 90 to 200 different companies. And the idea here is if you buy a chunk of that bucket, you now all at once own a tiny piece of 90 to 200 different companies. And the advantage there talks more to the point of diversification, which we may dive into more later. But if you buy one company and that company goes bankrupt, you've now lost all your money. But the chances of 90 to 200 companies going bankrupt all at once is very, very low. So it's generally considered a safer investment when you diversify your money in that way.
So that leads to an interesting point. Now, if I make profits on a stock, let's talk about this in terms of the tax implications of all these different things. If my stock goes up, I don't have to pay any money, right? Up until the point at which I sell it.
Great point. At the point you sell it, you are then on the hook for capital gains taxes, which will vary depending on how long you held the stock and what your income level is. But you do have to pay tax on a portion of that once you sell that and turn it back into the form of cash.
Now, there are some bonds, though, that I don't have to pay taxes on, right? Like municipal bonds, other bonds. And I have to examine the bond. I don't know specifically what it is. Different bonds have different returns and different tax implications, right?
Correct. And it is municipal bonds generally. It varies by state. So you need to take a look at different state rules because some states will charge state income tax on municipal bonds. But municipal bonds in general, the interest that the municipality, the city or county, that they pay to you is generally exempt from federal income tax. Now, the caveat is if the value of that bond increases and you sell it, you still have to pay a capital gains tax on that increase. So that's important to be aware of also.
That is a fascinating thing. So those are good points about the differences between the three primary things of investment. So in this case, if interest rates rise, what will typically happen to bond prices? Well, as I said, interest rate is the price of money. And so I will guess that if the price of money rises, the bond price, because what they're going to have to pay out in return and what you're going to have to pay to invest in it is going to rise as well. So I'm going to guess rise. So let's go to the next question. True or false? I already like my chances on this one. A 15-year mortgage typically requires higher monthly payments than a 30-year mortgage, but the total interest over the life of the loan will be less. So this is one that I am amazed how often people don't get, because you're going to have to help me out here, but I believe that on a 30-year mortgage, which is what most people are getting nowadays, it's not until year 24 that your payments are more than 50% principal. And maybe we should explain that too. The difference between the two payments in a mortgage payoff, the principal and the interest.
Yeah, great point. And that year, I'll have to double check that as well. But so first of all, the difference between principal and interest. When you make your mortgage payment every month, you hear the phrase all the time that people should buy because rent is just throwing money out the window. But when you buy a house on a 30-year mortgage, for the first several years, typically about 80% of that mortgage payment is going just to interest. You're actually not paying off the house. You're just paying interest on the loan for a long time. Now, a small portion of that payment does go into as a principal payment, which actually goes into the equity of the house, which is the part of the house that you actually own. But it's important to understand that not all of that is equity and principal progress. So it's important to be aware of that. And as you get closer to the end of the mortgage, more and more of your payments do count as principal payments that build that equity faster.
And so that's an interesting point too, because when you pay off, and so one of the things that I've always done, we're on our third house now, is that I like to think of the actual price that I'm paying for the house by looking at my mortgage payments and then multiplying how many of them there are. Because
Sure.
That's really how much I'm paying for the house. If I let's just hypothetically say I bought $100,000 house, but I was paying it back at, $1,000 a month for 20 years. The math doesn't quite work out, but I would say, okay, $1,000 a month, $12,000, 20 years, I'm paying back $240,000. Actually, that might be pretty close to right, come to think of it. And that's a better way, I think, to think about the money instead of saying, I'm paying $100,000 for a house. Because if you had a choice, and we're going back to the original question here, between paying, and you could afford it, a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage, you would clearly want the 15-year mortgage because you would spend so much less in interest, right?
That's exactly right, Dan. And that goes back to the principle we mentioned earlier of compounded interest. Because you've got interest on that house for a shorter period of time, the amount of interest you pay is actually, you'd think it would be half, but it's less than half because that interest doesn't have as long to compound on that loan. Not to mention, you often get a better interest rate at a 15-year mortgage than you do a 30-year mortgage.
Yeah, I will say that in all our houses, that's what we did is we went with a 15-year just because, doing the math and seeing how much we were paying, it was almost a 50% increase in the total price to go with a 30-year mortgage. And although the payments were a little bit bigger, and then the other interesting thing about that is that, one of the real consistent things in our lives, and I'm older than you, but like I can remember my parents dealing with crazy interest rates, 12%, stuff like that. I mean, we haven't seen 12% in a long time, but we've seen interest rates jump and climb. And the ability to refinance your house gives people a lot of options. However, one of the interesting things about it is that there's a phrase that a lot of people aren't familiar with, which is re-amortizing. And can you talk about what that is, to re-amortize a house?
Yeah, Dan, I appreciate the question. To be perfectly candid with you, I don't consider myself a mortgage expert. We certainly get into that a lot in finance.
Fair enough.
So,
well, I'll jump into that one thing about it, which essentially is, so re-amortizing your house is that, let's say that you've paid off 10 years of interest. You can say, okay, based on where my house is now, I've accumulated this much equity. And if I were to take out a loan for the rest of what the house is, so if I were to pay it off entirely and then take out another loan, which is essentially the bank shuffling the money for you, you can get a better interest rate because the amount that the bank has at risk. And that's really what the interest rate is the bank saying, okay, this is what it's worth for us to take the risk to lend you the money in the first place. And I'll jump in and make one more little political comment, which is that money lending is supposed to have risks. That's what the interest rate is supposed to reflect. And one of the reasons interest rates are lower now than they have been traditionally is because for a lot of lenders, there's not a lot of risk because the government guarantees the loans. But that throws a lot of things out of whack because it's not actually the government guaranteeing the loan, right? It's you and me. It's our taxpayer dollars that are actually guaranteeing the loan. And so figuring out what those things are is an important aspect to buying a house. It's not, when you go to buy a house, it's something that I always wish my home economics class had spent more time focusing on, because most people, when they buy their first property, have no idea what they're getting into. They don't understand points. They don't understand mortgages. They don't understand interest rates, any of that stuff. Find some time to find some people who you can talk to about that. So let's go on to, I'm going to say higher monthly payments, total interest less. That's clearly true. Let's go to the next question. Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. I feel like they're giving us softballs here.
Yeah, we talked about that one earlier.
Yeah, we nailed that one. We know for a fact that, unless, there are times that you might know something. And I'll give people an example. I read a white paper on AMD 7 years ago, and I looked at it and I said, AMD is about to crush Intel just based on the technical specs. And it was interesting because, and I go a little bit more into stocks and resistance points and stuff like that. And Intel fought them. Intel put out a lot of FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, misinformation about their product. But AMD went from 2 to 100 over the points of 7 years. But that being said, even though I knew that they had a technical product, I didn't put all my investments into AMD. I'm still all over the place. I put money in there based on doing it, but diversity is a critical thing for everybody, right? Because nobody can know what the market's got bringing.
Absolutely. Diversification is key. You might get some things right sometimes, but you're never going to get all things right all the time. So you have to protect yourself against that.
Yeah. And actually, I guess if I'm going to list some of my successes, I should list some of my colossal failures as well. There was a pharmaceutical company that, well, I'll list two. First, Lightbridge, LTBR, they're still around. They make thorium-based nuclear power plants. I read an article about them in 1994. I'm like, yeah, thorium nuclear power plants, that's where we're going. We've got this energy crisis, stuff like that. And the stock kept refinancing at a lower rate. So they would say, okay, for every 20 shares of the stock you have now you only have one share. And so they would keep inflating the price in the market to stay listed, because if you go below $1 on NASDAQ, you get delisted. But then I kept thinking, well, now they're coming back. And I kept doing the classic investment of throwing good money after bad, saying, now's the time to buy. I was like, now, I mean, I still have money sitting in the Lightbridge stock, but for the last 6 years, at least I've been able to stay away and not invest anymore in it. So yeah, you want to be diversified, because if I bet everything in that, I would be close to ruined, and that would be very unhappy. All right, so we're going to say false on this. Our next question, bonus question. Suppose you owe $1,000 on a loan and the interest rates have changed. And the interest rate you're charged 20% per year compounded annually. See, now they want to talk about compounding. If you didn't pay anything off at this interest rate, how many years would it take for the amount you owe to double? So this is a fascinating thing, because this is the thing that people don't get about interest and compounding in principle. So if I owe $1,000 and it charged 20% year compounded annually, the first year I would owe $1,020. But the second year I owe 20% of that $1,020. So it's going to be add in, sorry, no, not it'd be $1,200. So then second year I owe 20% of that $1,200. So that's $240. So I owe $1,440, 20%. I'm not going to figure out the rest of it, but it's going to be, how long would it take for it to double? 2 to 4 years is my guess. And then I'm going to turn off my phone. I apologize for that. So let's see how we did. Submit. 5 out of 6. What did I get wrong? I don't think I got anything wrong. I think they're wrong. If interest rates rise, what will typically happen to bond prices? Rise, fall, stay the same. It says they will fall. It says when interest rates rise, bond prices fall. When interest rates fall, bond prices rise.
That is correct. And the reason for that is when interest rates rise. So when interest rates rise, that means they're issuing new bonds that pay a higher coupon than the ones that existed previously. So the ones that existed previously are now worth less to the investor. So they have to drop the price of those bonds in order to make them attractive still. So that's an important consideration when you're investing in bonds. Bonds often have a reputation of being safer investments than stocks. And that's true to some degree. They tend to be less volatile, which means they don't go up and down in value as quickly and rapidly. But there's still a risk if you buy a bond or a bond mutual fund today and interest rates rise tomorrow, which, you know, they're pretty low right now. They can't really go much lower. So about the only way to go from here is up. Then that means the value of that investment in terms of what you could sell it for right now and get your money back is going to go down. So that's important to keep in mind.
That's a critical thing. And, you know, if we're going to talk about interest rates, let's talk about one of the really important vehicles that has an interest rate in it that people don't understand, a credit card. So when you look, most people hear, oh, my credit card has 0% interest for, you know, the first 30 days or something like that. But really, there's a big trap waiting there, isn't there?
There's a huge trap waiting there. You know, there have been studies done that same as cash loans, you know, 30, 90 days. It applies to credit cards, it applies to couch loans. But 88% of people who take out same as cash loans, expecting to pay them off within that period, or maybe just they get it just because it sounds enticing, they don't pay them off in that period. And what typically happens is the interest is backdated and you get hit with all of that cash, that same as cash time period, but now it's got interest on top of it. And something you mentioned earlier, Dan, was mortgage rates were 12% in the past. That being crazy, that's actually a relatively low interest rate for a credit card. So people are still borrowing money at those kind of interest rates today on a very regular basis.
And yeah, just to be clear, I think, you know, I got a credit card offer recently, and I just happened to look at it, and I think the APR was 21%, which is, terrible, really, really terrible. And the thing is, I'm a financially sound person. I have a good credit rating. Sometimes I think they just send you things with crazy interest rates because you think, oh yeah, why not? I could use one more special credit card. In this case, it was a gas company credit card, and I was like, it'd be crazy, but you decide not to pay it for 1 month or something like that. And so that's an interesting thing too, because a lot of credit cards well, for example, American Express is famous for, and don't mean this to be an ad for American Express, but on certain parts of their accounts, if you pay off the bill entirely that month, they don't charge you any interest on it. But they do that by charging the vendors more, which is why a lot of vendors don't take American Express. So it's definitely worth it to look at the bad credit card. Look at your credit card statement, see what you're paying. And then for a lot of people, it can be worthwhile to shop around for a credit card that matches their needs, right? There could be savings there.
Yeah, absolutely. The interest rate's very important. As a general rule, Dan, if you do pay the balance off before the due date, typically within 25 days of the purchase, they generally don't assess interest charges on that purchase. The thing to be careful about there is if you get yourself in a position where you've spent more money than you can then pay off before the due date, then you're going to have to carry a balance over to the next month. So I always caution people to be very careful about credit card use in general. But if you're going to sign up for a credit card to use it, definitely pay attention to the interest rate. Don't go in there with the mindset, oh, I'm going to pay this off before interest matters at all, because you're likely going to be in a situation where it will matter at some point.
And let's just throw one more thing on top of there. A lot of times credit cards will come with, bonus plans of miles or cash back money or anything like that. None of that means anything if you end up paying interest on it once, right? I mean, that's their rationale.
Oh, absolutely. The way you've got to look at it, these are huge companies that spend billions of dollars in consumer research. They understand the buying patterns and the spending behaviors of people. And they've done a lot of math behind this. They wouldn't offer these rewards points and these airline miles if they knew it wasn't going to be profitable for them at the end of the day. So they're getting fees, they're getting interest charges, they're getting vendor fees, like you mentioned previously. And so all those things go to that company's bottom line. At the end of the day, you're not going to beat up the credit card company. They're going to get their revenue one way or the other. So it's important to have that mentality around it.
And that leads into sort of one last statement on that, is that people should think of the fact that, the credit card companies are absolutely trying to make money. There may be a time and a place where it's an incredibly valuable resource for you to suddenly be able to give yourself a loan of, $5,000, $10,000 in the case of an emergency, or the convenience of not having to carry cash around with you, stuff like that. So I'm certainly not saying that credit cards are always a bad thing. There's times that it's very convenient for you, but it's definitely a phrase that I wish everybody knew. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Be very, very wary and cautious about the credit cards that you have. Now, we had a question up here, or a comment from Eskimo Libertarian saying, I'm being buried in awful student loans as it is. And there is more debt in student loans than there was in the housing bubble. At least that's my understanding right now, that it's a couple $1 trillion of student debt loan. And I imagine that's something that you think about and talk about. You were mentioning earlier, you've got a kid who's probably going to go to college someday. What are your thoughts about student loans in general?
Oh, I've got a lot of thoughts about student loans.
I thought you might.
Well, I want to touch on something you said earlier. There's a lot of government programs and policies that affect a lot of these financial issues. And student loans is definitely one of those things. The fact that student loans are federal loans, for the most part, there are private ones out there as well, but there are federally backed student loans in a plenty out there. That reduces risk from lenders. So these loans are very prevalently available. Anybody can get them without having to put anything up as collateral. So you can take a lot more in loans than what you could reasonably afford. So it's a little bit predatory in the way that it's set up that way. So that's another thing you have to approach with a really high degree of caution. And, I have some ground rules that I share with people who are looking to explore a degree, and they're probably a little bit more extreme than what you'd hear most places. But it's entirely possible with a lot of intentionality and planning to cash flow a lot of degrees. And I think in a lot of cases, that's typically the best way to do it. If you are going to take out a loan, you need to have a very calculated estimate of what your return on that investment is going to be. And you need to have a very intentional plan on how to pay that off aggressively so that you don't carry that around as a pet for the rest of your life. Can't hear you, Dan. I think you're muted.
That is going to be the title of my biography. Dan, you're muted. One of the interesting things about the way that the government backing of the loans has affected college tuition is something that, it's easy to look at. It didn't used to be that the government guaranteed student loans. And, the very first government-backed loan was actually the GI Bill, which was clearly worth it, right? Servicemen and women go off, service members go off, and the country wants to reward them picking up an educational cost. I wish we didn't have so many veterans because I wish we weren't so many foreign wars. I certainly don't begrudge them that reward. And the government saw that going to college made people's lives better. So honestly, with the best of all possible intentions, they said, well, why aren't more people going to college? And they found out that a lot of kids couldn't afford it, and they couldn't get loans from the banks. So the banks, the government went to the bank and said, why don't you lend more money to these kids? And the bank said, well, believe it or not, we're in the business of lending money. We want to lend as much money as we possibly can, but there's a risk involved in lending people money. And so, we evaluate the risk. And based on that, we decide who we're going to lend the loans to and what we're going to give them in terms of money. And so then the government said, well, what if we got rid of the risk for you? And the bank said, so wait a minute, if I lend out $1 million, I'm automatically going to be paid back? The government said, yes. If I lend out $1 billion, I'm going to, yes. So then the banks went to colleges and said, hey, we got a gravy train here. You open up the floodgates, start creating new colleges, new classes, raise the prices to whatever you want. We'll give the money. And so now college education is insane, right? It's my alma mater, UMass, University of Texas at Austin, is like $30,000 now, which for a state school is insane. When I was there, it was $800 a semester for unlimited credits. And it's all because there are these unlimited student loans. I've actually have a solution. I'm going to propose it to you right now. First, the biggest problem is that unlike any other house loan that you could take out, you could default, right? You can declare bankruptcy, and a judge looks at your wealth and your debt and says, okay, you don't have to pay that back. You only have to pay back a percentage of it. But for student loans, federally guaranteed student loans, you can never default on them. So you always have to pay them back. And this goes back to what I was talking about, the idea that money lending is supposed to have risk associated. Once the risk is gone, then the market gets entirely out of whack. So instead, let's say that the schools have to be the ones who give out the loans, because that's the way it actually used to work. The schools would give out the loans for people to go to school and then allow the students to default on them. So now the schools have to look at each kid as an investment. Are we going to educate them enough so that they could pay us back? And even if they didn't want to pay us back, we could potentially litigate and get the money back from them. But that would end degrees in, or a full scholarship to get a degree in, let's just say, French literature, right? Because somebody graduates a degree in French literature and it costs them $200,000, they're not going to be able, probably not going to be able to find a job to get that much money. Interesting option, get a credit card, pay off the student debt, and then default on the credit card. I'd never thought about that, but if you could get a credit card for your $120,000 worth of student debt, that's not a terrible way to do it. All All right. So we've hit the student loan issue somewhat. That brings us to a larger question, though, in terms of the way the government gets involved in the economy. And, one of the other investment vehicles that we didn't talk about were treasury bills. And so maybe we should talk about those very briefly. Do you want to talk?
Sure.
What do you think about treasury bills?
Yeah, treasury bills are essentially government bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury. So they're considered in the safest category of investment vehicles. They're almost cash equivalents. They pay very low interest rates compared to other investments, which have higher risk. Just like loans have risk attached to them, investments do as well. And more often than not, the potential returns of that investment are attached to the potential risk as well. So the treasury bills are backed by the full faith and credit of the taxing ability of the United States of America. So they're considered very safe investments, and they pay very low interest rates because of that. But they're extremely stable, and they are often used to balance out the volatility of portfolios for both individuals and for big corporate funds as well.
So if you needed to find a place you thought things were really going to go to hell, you can always invest in treasury bills. And there are different years and different interest rates of return. And there's too many investment vehicles for us to list them all. People should post in the comments if they have questions about some specific things. And Evan and I can do our best to answer questions in the comments as this goes on. And we'll be watching it for the next 2 or 3 days. Let's talk about ways that people can invest in themselves, because that's the best vehicle that you can possibly invest in, right? And one of the number one things you can do is to not put yourself in debt. And an easy way to do that, and a way to help yourself from going into debt, is to have a budget. Do you think that that's an important thing for people to work on, to focus on individual budgeting?
I absolutely do, Dan. And unfortunately, it's one of the most underutilized personal finance tools in our country today. And I can understand that to a degree. It sounds intimidating. It sounds like a lot of hard work. And it certainly can be at first, but it's kind of like riding a bike. Once you get it down, it becomes much and much easier to continue that process forward. But the significant thing about it is, once somebody starts writing a budget, which is an intentional plan for their money, typically a month in advance of when you plan on executing that, and then you do execute on it throughout the month, people that do that consistently save on average of 20% more than those who don't. Wow. So that's a big deal. That's kind of like getting a 20% raise. I don't know about you, but if I came into work tomorrow and my boss was like, I'm giving you a 20% raise, I'd be pretty excited about that. The fact is, you can give yourself a 20% raise by implementing that process if you're not doing it already.
And that's a critical thing. And one of the great things about the information revolution is there are some amazing tools out there. So I'm just going to advocate for one that I recommend. I used Mint for a while, and I consider myself a very savvy, financially literate person. But I can tell you that when I started to use Mint and I started to see some of the places where my money was going, I realized that I had some significant savings that I could make. And, if you could put $50 more a month aside and invest that in something with just a moderate rate of return over 20 years, that's an enormous return. And people don't realize the benefit of just saving, $50 a month is $2 a day.
Right.
You can find those things and that was one of the revelations for me was, as crazy as it sounds, seeing the numbers of how much I was spending at Dunkin' Donuts every week. And I'm like, honestly, I have a coffee machine at work. I have a coffee machine at home. What is my justification for $7 a day at Dunkin' Donuts? No justification whatsoever. Turned that around, and that became a fund. Another thing was, I remember the day, I have it written down, April 27th, 2001. I quit smoking. That is such an enormous savings now, because now a pack of cigarettes is, I don't even know. Somebody can tell us in the comments. The last time I looked, it's like $10 a pack, but I think it's $14 a pack on the East Coast now. That's insane. If you're spending $14 a day, unfortunately, there's no way to multiply that and figure out how much it is a year, but it's a lot of money. Let's just say that it's $10. Well, that's $15. So it's 10 plus half. So 365 days, 36 plus 18. So 54, $5,400 a year if you're smoking a pack a day at $15 a pack. That's crazy. Enormous. All these things that you can do if you're just tracking your expenses and realizing where that money is going makes such an important difference. So budgeting, I couldn't agree with you more on that. That's a huge thing. We got to have a question from the audience. What is one thing you wish you would have known when you were younger? And you've got some stories about financial literacy. So I'm interested to hear the answer to this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And there's actually two things. The budget, how important having a budget is the first one, but we've already talked about that. The other one is how important it is to avoid consumer debt. The analogy that I give people a lot of times is, debt is so normalized. It's, we borrow for our cars, we borrow for our houses, we borrow for student loans. Everybody's walking around with a credit card. But if you look at it mathematically, consumer debt is essentially reverse investing. You're paying interest instead of earning interest.
Right.
And a lot of people will come into my office and they'll want to start talking about investing, but they have an overwhelming amount of debt. And I have to help them understand, we've got to get you to stop reverse investing before you start forward investing, or you're going to get stuck in neutral and you're not going to make any significant progress. And that's something that took me a long time to learn that lesson.
And just as a very simple example of that, the quiz that we had a bunch of interest rates versus inflation and stuff like that, math things. But an easier way to look at it is that, if you were managing your own investments and you were getting a 7% annual return, you think you were doing a pretty good job.
Sure.
Should we talk about the rule of 72? It's my favorite.
Yeah, the rule of 72. It actually came up in one of those FINRA questions because it was talking about a loan that had a 20% interest rate. How long would it take the balance of that loan to double? And that's exactly what the rule of 72 is about. If you take the interest rate of an investment or even a loan and you divide the number 72 by that interest rate, it will give you approximately the number of years it takes for that balance to double. So that's a really good rule of thumb to take a look at when you're trying to determine the impact of a money decision over the long term.
Right. So just to do a little bit of that math, when we talked about that 20% there, I'm going to cheat and make it 24%. So if we divide 72 by 24, that's 3. So at a 24% interest rate, 3 years for the cost to double. And so now let's look at that in terms of if you were investing and you were getting a 7% return, you'd be pretty psyched. If you're getting 8% return, you'd be really happy. Let's take 8 because, we can divide 72 evenly by 8 and say, okay, if you're getting 8% return, your money is doubling every 9 years, which is awesome. However, if that's the return on your investment, if you're paying 12% interest on your credit card, which is a good credit card rate, but you're maintaining that over the time, you're losing money. And so if you could get a 12% return, which you can by paying off your credit card debt, that's a pretty easy place to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. So one of the important things, I want to do a little bit of station identification. This is the People for Liberty Lunch Power Hour. We put together shows like this all the time, talking about issues in the liberty movement. And in this case, we're talking about financial literacy. You can get more on our newsletter too at peopleforliberty.org. One of the important things about financial literacy is that your liberty is significantly increased if you're not in debt. And I think that you've got some good messages about that.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I actually, I've been trying to evolve the term of financial liberty because I see so many people have the opposite of that, which I call financial bondage. And I see that most commonly take the form of 5 different types of financial bondage. And I describe them as negative cash flow, feeling like you never have enough money to make ends meet. Overwhelming debt, we talked about that a little bit already, but you can't get ahead because all your money is going to debt payments. Unexpected setbacks, you're chugging along just fine, and something unexpected comes out of the woodwork and derails you, and you have to start over. We see that happen all the time, and it's very sad when that does happen. Lack of progress, feeling like you're just treading water and not getting anywhere, and burdensome taxes. The more you pay in taxes, the less you have for yourself, your family, and for causes that you care about. So helping people reduce and escape those types of financial bondage allows them to experience financial liberty. And I think when we get to a state of financial liberty, we're able to be less concerned about our own situation, and we can then do more to help other people. And I think we do that a lot more effectively than the government does when we get involved to that level.
You raise a point. I can't believe we're not even getting it to until now, the end of the show. There's probably a second show coming up about this. But the fact that you can do a lot in your personal life to reduce your taxes, which means not giving money to the government, is a critical thing. A couple of the big things that we can talk about just briefly is that people know the three basic retirement investment vehicles, and a 401k, an IRA, and a Roth IRA. But they may not understand the differences between them. Can you sort of define what those three are?
Yeah, absolutely. So a 401k is your most common employer-sponsored retirement plan. So if you work for most companies, a lot of companies will have that available for you to put a percentage of your paycheck in every pay period and let that grow in a tax-favored way for you to use in retirement. So there are two types of 401ks now, actually. There's a traditional 401k and a Roth 401k, just like there's a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA. Let me talk about the IRAs real quick, and then I'll talk about the difference between traditional and Roth. So an IRA is a retirement account, just like a 401k, but it's not an employer-sponsored account. Anybody can set up an IRA, and you can contribute up to $6,000 a year from earned income into it per person until the age of 50, and then you can contribute $7,000 a year. And they are tax favored, which means they get special tax privileges. And there are two types. You have a traditional 401k and a traditional IRA. Any money that you put into those accounts is pre-tax, which means you get to deduct it from your taxable income for that year. And that will save you money when you file your taxes for that tax year. Then that money will grow tax deferred. We talked about a little bit earlier that you pay capital gains taxes when your investments grow and you sell them normally. And you also get capital gains taxes in mutual funds as they sell things inside the funds every year. But if you've got your money inside a retirement account that's tax deferred, you don't have to worry about that. You're shielded from that while that's still in the account. Then when you take that money out of the account during retirement, which age 59 and a half is the year that you're able to do that without a penalty, then you're taxed on everything you take out of that account at your income tax rate. That's for traditional 401ks and traditional IRAs. Now, the Roth side of things is kind of the opposite of that. Any money you put into a Roth 401k or a Roth IRA, you don't get to deduct that from your taxes for that tax year. So it still counts as part of your income for that year. But what it does do, it then allows that money inside that account to grow tax-free. So when you take it out at age 59 and a half or later, then everything you take out of that account is tax-free. And free is a great word. I'm a big fan of that word.
I am a huge fan of free as well. One of the interesting things, too, is that when we talk about Roth, when you talk about any of the IRAs, there's a limit to how much you can put in there. Now, in your 401k, there's a limit to how much you can put in, but there's not a limit to how much your employer can put into your 401k. And so that's something that I always advise people. You can negotiate on that. And we could talk a little bit about negotiation, too, in terms of financial literacy. We've only got 7 minutes left, but fascinating statistic, 70% of men negotiate for salary at their first job, and only 7% of women do. I find all those numbers alarming. 100% of people should negotiate for the salary all the time.
Right.
But it is because there's a lot of things that your employer can give you that they're probably willing to if you ask for them, but their basic job is to get you to work for them as cheaply as they possibly can. So always ask away. One of the things that I've always been pleasantly surprised with is when I negotiate about the 401k. My last employer, my two employers ago, agreed to just flat out, instead of matching, because I was always going to max out my 401k, they just agreed to put in a big chunk of money into my 401k for me, which was awesome because I didn't have to pay any taxes on that. And there actually is a tax benefit for them putting money into my 401k as well. So it's a way for them to pay me, but actually pay me less than if they were to give me the money, it was a win-win for everybody. So people should definitely think about potentially asking, if your employer has a 401k, you definitely want to max out whatever they're going to match, because that's free money. But potentially ask them if they can give you even more, because a lot of times employers will at least think about it. You need to be at a larger company, but it's something that, you won't be the first person to ever have asked them, especially if I've worked there. So we're coming up to the end of the show. I'm becoming aware that we should do more on this, because I think that the idea of financial liberty is a critical element to the movement, because the movement needs help. We need people to be in a better financial place, to support candidates, to be aware of places where donations for litigation would be very helpful, all that sort of thing. What have we missed? What are the big topics, things that you're thinking about? These are the things I think people really should be aware of.
Yeah, so there's two things I want to say real quick, Dan. I just want to make a real quick illustration about wealth building. When people are having a hard time making ends meet, it's hard to visualize things like this. And I don't want to bring the message that it comes across as it's easy to build wealth, but it is possible. And that's the message I want to bring to people. An illustration I like to use is, if you invest $600 a month, every month for 30 years, which seems like a long time, but that's not a crazy amount of time for a younger person getting ready for retirement, at a 9% average annualized rate of return, which is aggressive, but it's not crazy. With both of those two things over 30 years, you're at over $1 million. So it's possible to become a millionaire. And a lot of people might be thinking, well, I don't have $600 to invest. And that may be true. But as you walk through this financial journey, if you do it with intentionality and you do it with a plan, you can get to a place where you can do that. And that can become a possibility for you and your family and the people and the causes that you care about. And the second thing I wanted to mention, Dan, was actually the 5 financial habits that I think everybody should live by, that are a big part of that process toward achieving that goal. And so they are: spend less than you make. Budgeting is a really important part of that financial habit. Be wise with debt. We talked about that a little bit already. Avoid consumer debt as much as possible. Protect yourself against setbacks. Have a solid emergency fund. Have the proper insurances in place to protect you from catastrophe. Have a short and a long-term plan. Be intentional with your goals. Be able to visualize it and track your progress toward it, and then give of yourself. The last one might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but there's a lot of research that's been done that shows people that are generous, they have a healthier mindset around money, and they have a better mental health in general. So those are the 5 financial habits I encourage people to live by. And when you execute on those well, it is possible to build wealth and to impact causes that you care about. You are muted, Dan.
My book is coming out any day now. You are muted, Dan. But that's a good thing. So let's make sure we come back to the thread. You and I can answer questions that are in there, and put that that list of those 5 things, because those are so critical. Evan, I want to thank you so much for being here. This is a show that I think I'm going to share a lot of times, because so many people in the Liberty movement don't know enough about the basics of financial literacy. Like, I'm getting some private messages of, wait a minute, I don't understand what a Roth IRA is. How do I get one? That sort of thing. So there's probably a possibility to go into some more detailed vehicles, but the number one thing, budgeting, getting rid of debt in your life, spend less than what you take home. Those are all critical things. So Evan, thanks so much. I look forward to seeing you my next visit to Tennessee. You said you're in Knoxville?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, I'm going to be happy. I've been to the Tennessee convention before. Excited to come back to the next one, and I will see you there in person. My name is Dan Fishman. I am Executive Director of the People for Liberty. Please check us out at peopleforliberty.org. Sign up for our newsletter. Find out who our guests are going to be. And there's several exciting things happening with People for Liberty in the upcoming months. So we will follow up with you via the newsletter, via the website, via all of our groups. Tomorrow at 1:00, we will have on the Ladies of Liberty Association, a wonderful group doing amazing work around the world to spread the movement of liberty. Ladies of Liberty Alliance, to spread the the liberty movement in places where it needs help. So please tune in tomorrow at 1 o'clock for Liberty Lunch Power Hour with the Lady of Liberty's Alliance. And I will see you then. Dan Fishman, Executive Director, peopleforliberty.org. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and please share this with everybody who you can.